Detective Tales, The Groundhog Day Tragedy, a Detective Agatha Marple mystery, thriller and suspense. And Chapter 1. The crime is discovered. It was early February in the year 1927, and the tiny town of Willowview shimmered beneath a mantle of freshly fallen snow. The preparations for the annual Groundhog Day festival lent the place a curious blend of rustic coziness and quiet glamour. Bright bunting stretched along the high street. Elegant shop windows showcased wooden groundhog figurines, and small electric lamps, still something of a novelty, cast an inviting glow on passers-by. Dawn had barely broken when gentle hush turned to sudden commotion, for a sharp, terrified scream pierced the tranquil morning air. At the centre of the disturbance stood the grand, ivy-clad Parkhurst residence. Within its distinctly modern rooms, fashioned with plush rugs, Art Deco lamps, and walls adorned with curious tapestries, a flurry of footmen and maids dashed about in obvious agitation. Martin Parkhurst, the festive season's beloved impresario, lay slumped at his cluttered desk, his face drained of colour. A series of typed notes detailing festival logistics fluttered to the floor. His wife, Dorothy, white-faced and trembling, lingered just outside the study door, unable to cross the threshold. In a town so small, tragedy spreads like wild rumours on a hot breeze, though on this wintry morning it travelled through anxious whispers in the crisp air. On the other side of the residence's wide entry hall, its tiled floor echoing with urgent footsteps, stood Miss Agatha Marple. She had come to Willowview only the previous night, ostensibly to offer her keen observations on folkloric customs and to enjoy a small holiday. Klebb, a discreet figure, she watched the commotion with the composed intensity of one well accustomed to life's little dramas. Though she spoke little, her clever grey eyes surveyed the scene, the half-written schedule scattered on the desk, the bruise that marred Martin's temple, the uneasy hush that settled over everyone else. The local constable, young and somewhat over-eager, appeared dumbstruck at the body before him. No bullet wound, no visible blood. At first glance one could mistake Mr. Parkhurst's sudden demise for a cruel quirk of fate. Yet the unnatural discoloration at his temple offered a disquieting suggestion. This was not the gentle passing of a man exhausted by festival duties, but something altogether more ominous. Agatha Marple, her attention drawn to that single telltale mark, suppressed a quiet sigh. She had seen too many such anomalies brushed away in other places, other times. Experience told her that accidents often had a habit of being more orchestrated than one cared to believe. Outside, the snowfall persisted, softening the clang and bustle of the townsfolk rushing to learn what had happened. Banners fluttered in the bitter wind, and the unlit carnival lamps around the village green swayed as though in sympathy. Faintly, Agatha caught the strains of a murmured conversation. Some remark about Martin's fragile constitution, another about the pressures of organising such a grand event. Yet, above all the speculation and gossip, one fact shone with stark clarity. Martin Parkhurst was dead. Whether by nature's hand or something far darker was now the question, and somewhere in the hush that followed that dreadful scream, Willowview braced itself for the answers that Agatha Marple, in her unassuming yet methodical way, would soon begin to uncover. Agatha Marple did not relish intruding on a scene of distress, yet it seemed inevitable in a town like Willowview. Drawn from her guest-room by that dreadful scream, she found herself quietly ushered into Martin Parkhurst's study just moments after the local constable pronounced the man dead. The detective's modest reputation had preceded her, or so it appeared. The mayor, his face drawn and pale beneath a bowler hat dusted with melting snow, approached her in a hushed, urgent manner. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I understand you're visiting for our folklore talk, but, things being what they are, might we trouble you to have a look around?" His tone was that of a man torn between shock and the need for swift action. "We would appreciate your, discreet assistance in clarifying the Agatha inclined her head, eyes drifting to the half-frozen window beyond which Willowview's streets lay silent. The usual bustle, shopkeepers and villagers chattering over biscuits and tea, had dwindled to an apprehensive murmur. A swirl of fine, glittering snow was caught in the bitter wind, dusting the thoroughfare with a fragile hush. Even the bright festival banners seemed subdued, fluttering listlessly, as if aware that the town's beloved figurehead had been snatched away. "How very unfortunate," Agatha replied, her voice tinged with genuine sympathy. "I'd hoped to speak of ancient celebrations and the curious customs around Groundhog Day. Instead, I find your festival overshadowed by tragedy." Her grey eyes flicked meaningfully toward the body. Parkhurst's broad shoulders slumped against the rich mahogany of his desk. A bruise marred his right temple, a dissonant mark upon an otherwise placid face. Across the narrow corridor, Dorothy Parkhurst's muffled sobs reverberated through the house, fueling the uneasy atmosphere. Servants in starched aprons scurried to and fro, uncertain whether to extend condolences or ready the parlour for visitors. Outside, the hush that had fallen over Willowview deepened, as though the very snowflakes conspired to keep secrets hidden. The festival committee, gathered awkwardly at the foot of the curving staircase, exchanged fearful glances. Without Martin's guiding hand, how might they proceed? Yet the crowd's concern was laced with a sliver of guarded hope that they would indeed continue. After all, the festival had long served as Willowview's crowning pride, its source of commerce and a highlight of each new year. Agatha Marple sensed their mingled emotions in the jittery hush of the foyer. The sorrow at Parkhurst's demise, the reluctance to see his life's work falter, and, perhaps, lurking beneath it all, a trace of self-interest. She had seen these impulses countless times before, a swirl of guilt, grief, and ambition mingling in the frosty air. "Well then," she said gently, setting down her handbag on a nearby sideboard. A flicker of dry wit played across her lips. "I dare say we have no choice but to investigate this frightful event. As quietly as possible, of course. After all, a town with its festival still to come cannot afford too much unpleasantness." She fixed the mare with a calm, resolute look. Outside, carriage rattled by on the icy road, its wheels crunching noisily in the near silence, the quiet presence of onlookers pressed against the windows like curious silhouettes, each face etched with both dread and anticipation. And thus, beneath the subdued glow of a single quivering light bulb, Agatha Marple prepared to peer into the shadows that blanketed Willowview, determined to piece together the circumstances of Martin Parkhurst's untimely end before suspicion or fear could break the town apart. Chapter 2. A subdued hush still blanketed Willowview when Agatha Marple entered the morning room of the Parkhurst residence. The vintage wallpaper, an ornate combination of gilded lilies and winding vines, seemed almost to press inward, as though sharing the household's mounting anxiety. Outside, the snowfall drifted gently, muffling the usual clatter of horses and motor cars that periodically passed along the main street. Despite the hush, a current of tension coursed through the air. Rumours of Martin Parkhurst's suspicious demise were spreading far quicker than the constable might have wished. At a small table near the window, Dorothy Parkhurst sat rigidly upright, her hands twisted in her lap. She had an unearthly pallor about her, barely more than a silhouette against the pale light of day. Her once ebullient demeanour, famed for organising tea dances and charitable soirees, had all but vanished. At the sight of Agatha, Dorothy attempted a polite smile, but it faltered into a trembling grimace. "As he was always so careful," Dorothy began, voice trembling. She dabbed at her red-rimmed eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I still cannot fathom it. He took pride in his health, you know, rarely a sniffle." Her words, spoken in a rapid staccato, hinted at desperation rather than genuine assurance. Agatha, who had found that people in shock often repeated mundane details, offered a sympathetic nod. "I quite understand, Mrs. Parkhurst," she said gently. "Yet there was the matter of that unfortunate bruise." Dorothy's hands flew to her mouth. "Yes, so they say. She inhaled in a series of shallow gasps, eyes darting toward the door as though fearing an eavesdropper. "But I cannot think of anyone who would wish Martin harm. Surely it was simply— well, I hate to indulge idle gossip. There is so much of it already." Agatha allowed a moment's silence, noting how Dorothy pressed her lips together. Was it genuine sorrow, or an unspoken secret? The detective's sympathetic expression was sincere, but behind it lay a watchful mind cataloguing every detail. The woman's trembling hands, her inability to meet Agatha's gaze, the repeated insistence that this was a natural death. Perhaps Dorothy was simply overwhelmed by grief, or perhaps her agitation stemmed from something else entirely. Before Dorothy could elaborate, the tall figure of Jonathan Wicks appeared in the hallway, his well-tailored coat and polished shoes all but announcing his wealth. He stepped into the room with an air of authority, offering Dorothy a brief, condoling bow. At once there was a subtle but distinct shift in the atmosphere, as though Wicks's presence brought with it a swirl of worldly ambition at odds with the house's claustrophobic gloom. "I do hope you are bearing up, Mrs. Parkhurst," Wicks said politely, though his tone betrayed little real warmth. His gaze flicked momentarily to Agatha, and in that fleeting glance there was calculation. "If there's anything I might do— the festival, for instance. I know Martin devoted himself wholeheartedly to it. We must carry on, of course, for Willowview's sake." Yes, I suppose we must," Dorothy whispered, eyes glistening. She dabbed her cheeks again, then turned resolutely to face the detective. "Miss Marple, you see, Jonathan was Martin's most generous sponsor. We wanted the festival to be bigger, worthy of outside visitors." "Ah," Agatha remarked with a small, thoughtful smile. "There has been talk of splendid expansions?" "At considerable expense, I imagine." Wicks lifted his chin. "Indeed. Some might call it extravagant, but one must speculate to accumulate, Miss Marple. Martin believed so as well, until recently." He paused, letting the words hang. Outside, the wind whistled across the white-draped rooftops, as though echoing the unspoken friction between them. Agatha detected a flicker of apprehension in Dorothy's eyes. She also detected the faintest tightening of Wicks's jaw. Was there resentment lurking behind these polished manners? Had Martin Parkhurst rescinded support for expansions, sparking disagreements? The questions lingered between them, unvoiced yet unmistakable. A clock on the mantel chimed, interrupting the charged silence. In that moment, the elaborate wallpaper, the plush carpet, and the swirl of the snowfall outside combined into a single claustrophobic hush, a hush that seemed to mark the threshold of secrets poised to unravel. It was clear to Agatha that in Willowview motives ran as deep as any city's back alleys, cloaked though they might be by fresh snow and polite smiles. As the room settled into an uneasy silence following Jonathan Wicks's curt remarks, the heavy oak door to the study creaked open once more. This time a slender woman with chestnut hair cascading in soft waves down her back stepped inside. Kelly Stokes, Willowview's dedicated zookeeper, carried herself with a mixture of determination and weariness. Her practical attire, a sturdy brown coat cinched at the waist, paired with dark trousers and well-worn boots, contrasted sharply with the opulent surroundings of the Parkhurst residence. In her gloved hands she held a small, neatly folded notepad, the edges frayed from constant use. "Miss Marple," Kelly began, her voice steady yet edged with frustration, "I came to speak with Mr. Parkhurst about the recent changes to Winston's enclosure. The fireworks last night were particularly disruptive, and I fear they've unsettled him more than usual." Her eyes, a striking shade of green, darted briefly toward Martin's study before meeting Agatha's gaze. Agatha nodded thoughtfully, noting the tension in Kelly's stance. "I understand your concerns, Miss Stokes. The well-being of Winston is certainly paramount, especially with the festival's prominence." Her tone was both sympathetic and probing, a delicate balance that invited Kelly to divulge more without feeling cornered. Kelly took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the notepad. Martin was adamant about expanding the festival, making it a grander affair to attract visitors from afar. I've voiced my reservations repeatedly, fearing that such changes might compromise the charm that makes Willowview unique. Last night, after our brief exchange, I left the study feeling uneasy." She paused, glancing toward Dorothy, whose sorrowful presence seemed to weigh heavily on the room. "Ecti of the gravitoire." Before Agatha could respond, the door swung open once again, revealing a man in his early 50s with a dignified bearing. Lawrence Atkins, the town historian, entered with an air of quiet authority. His neatly combed silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles lent him an air of scholarly refinement. Clad in a tweed blazer with elbow patches and a crisp white shirt, Lawrence carried a leather-bound notebook under one arm, the corners of which bore the marks of frequent use. "Good morning, everyone," Lawrence greeted, his voice smooth and measured. "I trust we can proceed without further delay." His eyes sparkled with a hint of enthusiasm as they settled on Agatha. "Miss Marple, I must say, it's an honor to have someone of your expertise assisting us in this matter. The history of Willowview is a subject dear to my heart, and I believe there are layers to this tragedy that mere appearances cannot reveal." Agatha offered a polite smile, appreciating his eagerness. "Thank you, Mr. Atkins. Your knowledge of the town's history will undoubtedly prove invaluable." She turned her attention back to Lawrence, observing the subtle way his fingers tapped against the notebook. "Were you working closely with Mr. Parkhurst on the festival's official program?" Lawrence nodded, stepping further into the room to take a seat beside Kelly. "Indeed. We've been collaborating to ensure that the festival not only honors tradition, but also educates visitors about Willowview's rich heritage. Martin was passionate about preserving our customs while embracing necessary advancements." Dorothy, still visibly shaken, interjected softly. "Martin and Lawrence were quite the team. They spent countless hours planning the details, ensuring everything was perfect." Her eyes flickered with a mixture of pride and sorrow, hinting at deeper bonds and perhaps unspoken tensions. Agatha leaned forward slightly, her gaze shifting between Kelly and Lawrence. "Miss Stokes, you mentioned feeling uneasy after your discussion with Mr. Parkhurst. Did you notice anything, or anyone, peculiar that evening? Any signs of distress or disagreement beyond the topic of the fireworks?" Kelly hesitated, her brow furrowing as she recalled the night before. "Well, there was some raised voices. Not heated, but Martin seemed more agitated than usual. He dismissed my concerns rather abruptly, and then there was the break-in last night. Someone tampered with Winston's enclosure, leaving it in disarray. It's not the first time, but this time it felt more deliberate, more personal." Lawrence's expression remained impassive, though Agatha detected a flicker of something akin to annoyance beneath his calm exterior. "A tampering incident, you say? That's troubling. Winston is, after all, the heart of the Groundhog Day Festival. Ensuring his well-being is crucial." Dorothy glanced nervously between the two newcomers. "I fear that the stress of the festival's expansion has been taking its toll on everyone, including Martin. Perhaps these recent disturbances are a manifestation of that pressure." Agatha noted the interplay of emotions and motives. "It seems there are several layers to this situation. Financial pressures from expansion, concerns for Winston's welfare, and now potential threats against Martin. Each element could provide a piece of the puzzle we need to solve." As the conversation continued, the room seemed to grow smaller, the ornate furnishings and heavy drapes amplifying the sense of claustrophobia. Outside, the relentless snowfall muffled the sounds of the town, wrapping Willowview in a silken blanket that both concealed and preserved its secrets. Agatha allowed herself a moment to survey the assembled group. The grieving widow, the ambitious sponsor, the passionate zookeeper, and the meticulous historian. Each carried their own burdens, their own motives, and perhaps their own reasons for wanting Martin Parkhurst out of the picture. "Thank you for your insights, everyone," Agatha concluded, rising gracefully from her seat. "I will need to speak with each of you individually to gather more information. In the meantime, please try to remain as composed as possible. The success of the festival depends not only on our ability to honor tradition, but also on our capacity to overcome the challenges we face. As Agatha stepped out of the study, the weight of her task settled upon her shoulders. Willowview, with all its charm and hidden tensions, was now a tapestry of secrets waiting to be unraveled, and she, ever the observant detective, was determined to weave together the threads of truth from the intricate patterns of deception. The day progressed with a deceptive calm. Agatha took her first steps toward unraveling the mystery, her mind already piecing together the fragments of information gleaned from her initial interaction. Each character, with their distinct motives and hidden agendas, presented both opportunities and obstacles in her quest for the truth. In the grand drawing room, the interplay of light and shadow from the tall windows created an ever-shifting mosaic on the richly patterned rug. The opulence of the space, with its heavy velvet drapes and antique furnishings, seemed to stifle the guests within, amplifying the underlying tensions. Agatha Marple, however, moved through it with the ease of one who had navigated similar labyrinths of human complexity before. As the morning gave way to afternoon, Agatha found herself contemplating the subtle clues that had been presented. The bruised temple of the deceased, the tampered groundhog enclosure, the financial disagreements over the festival's expansion, and the seemingly impeccable yet possibly fabricated alibis of those present. Each piece was a part of a larger, more intricate picture, one that required careful consideration and a discerning eye to fully comprehend. With the townspeople of Willowview harbouring their secrets beneath layers of polite conversation and outward appearances, Agatha knew that the path to the truth would be fraught with misdirection and deceit. Yet her unwavering determination and keen intellect promised that no secret could remain hidden for long in the watchful town of Willowview. Chapter 3. The morning sun cast long, pale shadows across Willowview's main street, glinting off the freshly fallen snow and illuminating the intricate frost patterns on the windows of the town's establishments. Despite the festive preparations for Groundhog Day, an undercurrent of unease persisted, tethered tightly to the recent tragedy. Agatha Marple, ever observant, noted how the townspeople navigated their daily routines with a newfound wariness, their smiles less assured, their greetings more subdued. In the corner of the Silver Spoon Cafe, a modest establishment adorned with checkered tablecloths and brass fixtures, sat Calvin Morris. Once a familiar face in Willowview, Calvin had returned a year prior, seeking solace and a fresh start after a tumultuous period that had left his reputation marred by whispers and wary glances. Today, however, his presence seemed to stir a different kind of tension. Calvin was a tall man, with broad shoulders that spoke of past physical labour, now softened by the slump of someone burdened by unseen weights. His dark hair was neatly combed back, though a few rebellious strands framed his face, hinting at a restless mind. A thin scar traced a line above his left eyebrow, a remnant of a confrontation that Calvin rarely spoke of. His eyes, a deep hazel, held a mixture of defiance and vulnerability, darting around the cafe as if seeking both acceptance and concealment. As Agatha entered the cafe, the murmur of conversations momentarily hushed, eyes briefly flickering towards her before resuming their subdued exchanges. She approached Calvin's table with the grace of one accustomed to delicate social balances. "Good morning, Mr. Morris," Agatha greeted, her voice warm yet carrying an undercurrent of inquiry. Calvin looked up, his expression guarded before softening slightly upon recognizing her. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged, offering a nod. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Agatha took a seat opposite him, her posture relaxed yet attentive. "I wanted to speak with you privately, if that's agreeable. There are a few matters regarding Mr. Parkhurst's passing that I believe you might shed some light on." Calvin's jaw tightened, and he glanced around the cafe before leaning in, lowering his voice. "I can imagine you have a lot of questions, Miss Marple. I assure you I had nothing but respect for Martin." Agatha raised an eyebrow, sensing the underlying tension. "Respect, yes, but I understand there were complexities in your relationship." Calvin sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Complexities is one way to put it. Martin helped me when I was at my lowest, lent me the money to get back on my feet, but he also had a way of reminding me of that favour, never letting me forget the debt. Agatha nodded thoughtfully. Such reminders can be burdensome. Did this ever lead to disagreements between you two? He hesitated, then nodded slowly. Occasionally, Martin had grand visions for Willowview's festival, plans that I didn't always see eye to eye with. He wanted to expand, to attract more visitors. I believed in preserving the town's charm, not turning it into some commercial spectacle. Agatha leaned forward, her eyes meeting his. Were there any recent disputes that might have escalated beyond professional disagreements? Calvin shook his head firmly. No, nothing of that sort. I came here to rebuild, not to reignite old tensions. Yes, we argued about the festival's direction, but that was all. As their conversation unfolded, Agatha couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in Calvin's demeanour, moments of irritation quickly masked by forced calm, flashes of anger softened by— It was a dance she had seen before, one that hinted at deeper undercurrents beneath the surface of polite conversation. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Willowview in a serene yet isolating silence. Inside, the cafe's warmth provided a stark contrast to the cold reality of Martin Parkhurst's death. Yet within those walls, secrets lingered like the steam rising from Calvin's lukewarm coffee. Agatha allowed a moment of silence before continuing. It must be difficult to reconcile gratitude with resentment. Do you believe anyone might have held such conflicting emotions towards Martin? Calvin's eyes flickered with a mixture of frustration and sorrow. If anyone did, it wasn't me. Martin was fair in his dealings, but his ambitions sometimes overshadowed our personal relationships. If someone has taken advantage of that, I don't know who it would be. Agatha made a mental note of his words, sensing both sincerity and an attempt to distance himself from potential suspicion. Thank you, Mr. Morris. Your perspective is invaluable. As Agatha stood to leave, Calvin reached out, clasping her hand briefly. If you need anything else, anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. Willowview isn't the same without Martin, and we all want to see it thrive again. She offered a polite smile in return, though her mind was already weaving through the threads of information Calvin had provided. His redemption arc was just beginning, marked by his desire to shed past mistakes and prove his worth to a community that had once turned its back on him. Yet, in the shadow of Martin's death, old suspicions resurfaced, threatening to drag Calvin back into the role of the outcast. As Agatha stepped back into the bustling main street, the weight of her responsibility pressed upon her. Willowview, with its snow-covered streets and tightly knit populace, held many secrets beneath its picturesque facade. Calvin Morris was but one thread in the intricate tapestry she needed to unravel, each step bringing her closer to the heart of the mystery that had enveloped the town. The cafe door jingled softly behind Agatha as she made her way to the next interview, her mind meticulously cataloguing Calvin's statements and the subtle cues that accompanied them. In Willowview, where every face was familiar and every story intertwined, discerning the truth required not just observation, but an understanding of the delicate human emotions that often obscured it. As she walked, Agatha's thoughts lingered on Calvin's predicament, a man striving for redemption, yet perpetually haunted by his past. Could his struggle be more than mere coincidence? Or was it simply the town's penchant for casting suspicion on those who dared to return and rebuild? The answers, she mused, lay hidden in the layers of Willowview's opulent yet claustrophobic settings, waiting to be uncovered beneath the veneer of small-town charm. The grand drawing-room of the Parkhurst residence, with its high ceilings and heavy velvet drapes, felt more like a gilded cage than a place of comfort. The ornate fireplace, crackling softly, cast flickering shadows that danced across the richly patterned rug. Agatha Marple sat gracefully in a high-backed armchair, her posture impeccable yet relaxed, as the first of her interviews commenced. In her feverish mind, Dorothy Parkhurst entered the room with hesitant steps, her dark eyes red from sleepless nights. She settled into a nearby fauteuil, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room seemed to press in around her, the opulence amplifying her visible distress. "Mrs. Parkhurst," Agatha began gently, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me again. I understand this is a difficult time." Dorothy offered a fragile smile, though her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. "Of course, Miss Marple. I want nothing more than to find out what happened to Martin." Agatha nodded sympathetically. "I'd like to revisit the evening before Martin's passing. Could you walk me through your last moments with him?" Dorothy took a deep breath, her voice wavering. "We had dinner together, as we always do on Fridays. It was quiet, but Martin seemed distracted. He kept glancing at his watch and muttering about meeting someone later that evening." Agatha observed the slight tremor in Dorothy's hands. "Did he mention who he was meeting?" Dorothy shook her head slowly. "No, he didn't. Just that it was urgent. I thought he was preoccupied with festival preparations." Agatha leaned forward, her eyes sharp yet kind. "Were there any disagreements or unusual tensions between Martin and anyone else recently?" Dorothy hesitated, her gaze dropping to her clasped hands. "There have been some disagreements with Jonathan Wicks over the festival's direction. Martin wanted to preserve the town's traditions while Jonathan pushed for expansion." Agatha made a mental note of the recurring conflict. "I see. And after dinner, what happened?" Dorothy's voice grew softer. "Martin retired to his study to finish some paperwork. I remained in the dining room, reading. Later that night I heard noises, raised voices, I think. When I went to check, Martin was already gone." Agatha watched as Dorothy's composure wavered. "Did you see or hear anything else that evening? Any unusual visitors or sounds?" With Dorothy's interview concluded, Agatha stood and motioned for the next individual to enter. Jonathan Wicks approached, with the grace befitting his social standing, his tailored suit immaculate despite the wintry chill outside. He exuded an air of authority, his every movement precise and controlled. "Mr. Wicks," Agatha greeted him warmly, gesturing to a seat opposite her. "Thank you for taking the time to speak with me." Jonathan nodded, his expression polite but reserved. "Of course, Miss Marple. I trust you are finding Willowview agreeable despite the current circumstances?" Agatha smiled faintly. "Thank you. I'd like to discuss your relationship with Martin Parkhurst and your views on the festival's expansion." Jonathan leaned back, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. Martin was a visionary in his own right. His dedication to Willowview was unparalleled. However, our visions for the festival diverged significantly. Agatha raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "Martin believed in maintaining the festival's quaint charm, emphasizing tradition and community. I, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to elevate Willowview's status, attracting tourists and boosting the local economy. Naturally, such differing ambitions led to heated discussions." Agatha noted the controlled agitation in his demeanor. "Were these disagreements escalating recently?" Jonathan sighed, his posture relaxing slightly. "To some extent. Martin was resistant to large-scale changes, fearing they would dilute the festival's essence. I argued that expansion was necessary for sustainability. We reached an impasse that I am afraid may have contributed to his unfortunate demise." Agatha's eyes remained fixed on Jonathan. "Did you ever believe that Martin might take drastic measures to prevent the festival's expansion?" Jonathan shook his head firmly. "Never. Martin was a man of integrity. While we disagreed, I couldn't fathom him resorting to anything unthinkable." Agatha leaned forward, her gaze penetrating. "On the evening before his death, did you have any direct interaction with Martin, beyond your professional disagreements?" Jonathan considered the question carefully before replying. "We met briefly to discuss the final details of the festival's budget. It was a cordial meeting, albeit tense. Martin seemed more stressed than usual, but I assured him that our financial contributions would support his plans, not hinder them." Agatha made a note of the timeline. "Did anyone else?" Jonathan shook his head. "Only the regular staff and myself. Martin trusted them implicitly. If someone had entered his study, it would have been someone we all knew well." Agatha nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mr. Wicks. Your insights are most helpful." As Jonathan stood to leave, Agatha couldn't help but notice the slight limp in his step, a detail he seemed unaware of revealing. It was a small, almost imperceptible clue, but one that Agatha tucked away for later consideration. Once alone, Agatha Marple sat back, her mind weaving through the threads of information gathered so far. Dorothy Parkhurst's inconsistent recounting hinted at deeper layers of grief or possible concealment. Jonathan Wicks's composed demeanour belied the underlying tensions that could have motivated conflict with Martin. Agatha's eyes wandered to the ornate clock on the mantel, its steady ticking a stark contrast to the chaos of emotions within the room. She mused over the subtle signs, Dorothy's nervousness, Jonathan's restrained frustration, and the unanswered questions that lingered like shadows in the opulent space. Outside, the snowfall continued unabated, cloaking Willowview in a serene yet isolating blanket. The town's festive exterior masked the turmoil brewing beneath, much like the hidden motives of its residents. Agatha knew that the truth lay hidden within these layers, waiting to be uncovered through careful observation and insightful deduction. Determined to delve deeper, Agatha resolved to interview the remaining key figures: Kelly Stokes, the passionate zookeeper, and Lawrence Atkins, the meticulous town historian. Each held pieces of the puzzle, their interactions with Martin Parkhurst potentially unveiling motives and alibis that could either clear their names or implicate them in the mysterious death. As she prepared to leave the drawing room, Agatha's dry wit surfaced in a quiet remark. "It appears Willowview is as snowed under with secrets as it is with snowflakes. Let us hope we can melt away the layers and reveal the truth beneath." With a final glance around the claustrophobic yet opulent room, Agatha Marple stepped out into the crisp morning air, her mind sharp and attuned to the subtle nuances that would guide her investigation. The interviews had only begun to scratch the surface, and the path to uncovering the truth promised to be as intricate and delicate as the frost-laden windows of the Parkhurst residence. The ornate library of the Parkhurst residence, with its towering bookshelves and rich mahogany panelling, exuded an air of restrained elegance. Heavy drapes framed the tall windows, their intricate patterns casting intricate shadows upon the Persian rug below. The scent of polished wood and aged paper lingered, creating a suffocating yet sophisticated atmosphere. Agatha Marple sat at a polished writing desk, her notepad poised, as the first of her scheduled interviews commenced. Kelly Stokes entered the library with purposeful strides, her practical attire a stark contrast to the room's opulent decor. Her olive-green parka was neatly fastened, and her dark hair was tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. Despite her sturdy appearance, there was an underlying tension in her posture, a testament to her protective instincts over Winston, the town's cherished groundhog. "Miss Marple," Kelly greeted, her voice steady but edged with frustration. "I trust you're finding the arrangements here satisfactory, given the circumstances?" Agatha offered a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. Please, have a seat." Kelly sat down, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. "Of course. I want to help in any way I can." Agatha leaned forward, her eyes attentive. "I understand you had a disagreement with Martin Parkhurst regarding Winston's enclosure. Could you elaborate on that?" Kelly sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Yes. Martin decided to relocate Winston to a larger enclosure to accommodate the anticipated increase in visitors. I opposed the move, fearing it would disrupt Winston's routine and well-being. I voiced my concerns repeatedly, but Martin was insistent. Last night, after our discussion, I left his study, feeling unsettled." Agatha noted the firmness in Kelly's tone. "You mentioned earlier that you left Martin alive. Can you confirm that?" Kelly nodded resolutely. "Absolutely. I swore I didn't harm him. My only interest was in protecting Winston and maintaining the integrity of our traditions." Agatha's eyes flickered with subtle curiosity. "Were there any unusual noises or signs of distress during your conversation with Martin?" Kelly hesitated for a moment before responding. "There were raised voices, yes. Martin was more agitated than usual. but I didn't see anyone else enter the study. It was just the two of us." Agatha made a mental note of the raised voices and Martin's agitation. "Did Martin mention anything else during your conversation? Any threats or hints about changing his stance?" Kelly shook her head slowly. "No threats, nothing of that sort. It was purely about the enclosure and Winston's future." Agatha allowed a moment of silence, her mind processing the information. "Thank you, Kelly. Your dedication to Winston is commendable, and your insights are invaluable." As Kelly rose to leave, Agatha couldn't help but notice the fleeting shadow of worry that crossed her face. Perhaps a remnant of her fears for Winston, or something more concealed beneath her protective exterior. The door to the library swung open once more, and in stepped Lawrence Atkins, the town historian. His presence was understated yet commanding, clad in a meticulously pressed tweed blazer with elbow patches that spoke of his scholarly pursuits. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his wire-rimmed spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. Clutching a leather-bound notebook, Lawrence carried an air of quiet authority that seemed almost out of place in the room's lavish setting. "Good morning, Mr. Atkins," Agatha greeted him warmly. "Please, join us." Lawrence offered a polite nod before settling into the chair opposite her. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I trust you're making progress in your inquiries?" Agatha returned his nod with a faint smile. "Thank you. I'm eager to hear your account of the evening before Martin's passing. Your collaboration with Martin on the festival's program must provide some useful insights." Lawrence adjusted his glasses, opening his notebook with deliberate care. "Indeed, Martin and I were working late into the evening, finalizing the historical exhibits for the festival. Our goal was to blend tradition with educational value, ensuring that visitors could appreciate Willowview's rich heritage." Agatha observed his precise mannerisms, noting the meticulous way he recorded details. "Can you describe your interactions with Martin that evening? Were there any disagreements or unusual tensions?" Lawrence smiled slightly, a gesture that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Our collaboration was harmonious, Miss Marple. Martin was passionate, yes, but always open to discussion. We shared a mutual respect for each other's expertise. I can't recall any significant disagreements that night." Agatha raised an eyebrow, sensing a subtle evasion. "You mentioned finalizing the historical exhibits. Were there any last-minute changes or additions that Martin was particularly keen on implementing?" Lawrence tapped his notebook thoughtfully. "There was one addition, a detailed account of Willowview's founding families. Martin believed it would add a personal touch to the festival, fostering a deeper connection for attendees. It was a minor alteration, but one that excited him." Agatha leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "And where were you during the time Martin was found dead? Did you leave the study at any point?" Lawrence's response was prompt and precise. "I remained in the study until approximately 10 o'clock, when I decided to take a short break in the library. I returned shortly after to continue our preparations. At no point did I leave the study unattended." Agatha noted the consistency in his account, yet the perfection of his alibi raised subtle suspicions. "Did anyone else have access to the study that evening? Any unexpected visitors or interruptions?" Lawrence shook his head firmly. "Only the usual staff and myself. Martin trusted them implicitly. If someone had entered the study, it would have been someone we all knew well." Agatha allowed a moment of silence, her mind working through the layers of Lawrence's testimony. "Thank you, Mr. Atkins. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated." As Lawrence stood to depart, Agatha couldn't shake the feeling that his overly meticulous account was designed to obscure something. His calm demeanour and precise recollection were both reassuring and oddly unsettling, hinting at a depth of secrecy that belied his scholarly experience. With Kelly and Lawrence accounted for, Agatha turned her attention to Calvin Morris, who had requested a private interview at the town's modest library. The building, a stark contrast to the opulent residences, exuded a sense of utilitarian simplicity. Its brick facade and large, unadorned windows hinted at Calvin's practical nature, a sharp divergence from the decorative excesses of the Parkhurst estate. Calvin sat alone at a small table, his demeanour uneasy yet determined. His broad shoulders and tall frame gave him a presence that seemed both protective and burdened. The cafe's subdued lighting cast soft shadows on his face, accentuating the lines of worry etched around his hazel eyes. Agatha approached quietly, taking a seat across from him. "Mr. Morris, thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Calvin offered a tentative smile, though his eyes remained guarded. "Mr. Marple, I appreciate you taking the time." Agatha nodded, her tone gentle yet probing. "I understand you're eager to clear your name regarding Martin's death. Can you walk me through your activities on the evening in question?" Calvin took a deep breath, his fingers nervously tapping against his coffee cup. "Certainly. After my shift at the workshop, I stopped by Martin's office to discuss the outstanding loan he had extended to me. I wanted to assure him I was making progress on repaying it." Agatha observed his fidgeting hands and the slight tremor in his voice. "Did Martin seem receptive to your discussion? Any tension between you two?" Calvin hesitated before responding. "At first, yes. Martin was concerned about the delays in repayment. He insisted on stricter timelines, but we managed to reach an understanding. He promised to extend the deadline given my circumstances." Agatha leaned forward, her gaze penetrating. "And where were you after leaving Martin's office?" Calvin paused, a shadow crossing his features. "I went straight home. I have no alibi beyond that. It was a quiet evening otherwise." Agatha noted the absence of further details. "Did you encounter anyone unusual on your way home? Any interactions that seemed out of the ordinary?" Calvin shook his head firmly. "No, nothing. Just the regular townfolk going about their business." Agatha studied him carefully, noting the tightness around his eyes and the defensive posture he occasionally assumed. "You've been a part of Willowview for a year now, seeking a fresh start. How has the community received you?" Calvin sighed, a mixture of frustration and resignation in his expression. "Most are welcoming, though some remain skeptical. My past mistakes are still talked about, and it's challenging to shake that shadow. I'm trying to prove myself, especially to Martin, who gave me a chance when no one else would." Agatha's mind sifted through his words, searching for inconsistencies. "And Martin never mentioned any concerns about your repayment plans?" Calvin shook his head. "No, nothing beyond our initial discussions. He was always fair, even when we disagreed." Agatha offered a sympathetic smile. "I understand this is difficult for you, Mr. Morris. Your willingness to cooperate is appreciated." As Calvin rose to leave, Agatha couldn't help but ponder his uneasy demeanour and the lingering resentment he harboured. His past, though overshadowed by Martin's generosity, seemed to cast a long shadow over his present intentions. Was his quest for redemption genuine? Or was there more beneath the surface, perhaps a hidden motive intertwined with the town's secrets? With the interviews concluded, Agatha Marple retreated to her private study, the room's opulent furnishings offering a stark contrast to the stark realities she was uncovering. The grand clock ticked steadily, its sound a metronome to her contemplative silence. She spread out her notes, each interview a piece of the intricate puzzle that was Martin Parkhurst. Dorothy Parkhurst's inconsistent recounting hinted at deeper layers of grief or possible concealment, while Jonathan Wicks's controlled frustration suggested underlying tensions that could mask more sinister motives. Kelly Stokes's protective instincts over Winston introduced another dimension of conflict, intertwining personal loyalty with professional duty, and Calvin Morris, with his uneasy demeanour and troubled past, embodied the classic red herring. An outcast seeking redemption, yet still haunted by his previous missteps. Agatha's dry wit surfaced in a quiet remark to herself. "It seems Willowview is as tangled as the ivy on the Parkhurst residence's facade, each vine concealing its own twist and turn." She sifted through her notes, highlighting key details, the raised voices heard by Dorothy, the meticulous alibi of Lawrence Atkins, and the planted scarf found on Calvin's person. Each clue, though seemingly insignificant on its own, began to weave a complex narrative that Agatha was determined to unravel. As dusk began to settle over Willowview, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets, Agatha knew that the true nature of the mystery lay hidden beneath layers of deception and subtle misdirection. The town's opulent yet claustrophobic settings mirrored the tangled web of human emotions: greed, jealousy, fear, each thread essential to the tapestry of truth she sought to uncover. Determined yet patient, Agatha Marple prepared for the next phase of her investigation. The interviews had only deepened the enigma, and the path forward promised to be as intricate and delicate as the frost that adorned Willowview's picturesque facade. With each step she edged closer to the heart of the mystery, her keen intellect poised to pierce through the veil of secrets that cloaked the town in silent tension.